Welcome to Unit 1, Section 2. This is going to be early exploration and imperialism, and Section 2 specifically focuses on the French and the English colonies. Last time we spoke about the Spain and Portuguese. This time we're going to be talking about the English and the French, and specifically how they had very different ways of imperializing, but really the same goal. And we'll talk about how they did that and what that influence was on the United States. So here's our objectives. Make sure that these are answered as you're taking notes. Focus question has not changed. How has imperialism impacted the United States with its development of foreign policy? And it might be difficult here with these early countries as they're not the United States. So how do they have an impact on our foreign policy today? But one thing that I hope you understand is that these countries and the efforts of them being imperialistic makes it so we have an example. So, if nothing else, you can always argue that the United States' modern day foreign policy, the way that it interacts with other countries, may, in a great deal or maybe a little, be related to Portugal, Spain, England, and France and their imperialism to us. Does that make sense? If a bully bullies you, then you might become a bully yourself, and that might have an impact on you. Same thing here. If we're being imperialized, and certainly the early indigenous people of the Americas were imperialized, then we might do that ourselves when we become our own country because it's the practice that we see the rest of the world doing. Objective 1, how and why were the French more successful with the Native Americans? The French, out of all the other groups, probably got along best with the Native Americans. That does not mean everything was hunky-dory and everybody was happy and fine. It does mean, though, that there was a difference between the Spain and the Native Americans. The Portuguese really had at least as far as North America goes, had very little impact with the Native Americans, and the English had a lot to do with the Native Americans. And so, why did the French have a different approach and a different outcome than the rest of them? What are the two earliest colonies for the English? We're going to be talking about the different types of colonies that there are, and specifically, you should know what the earliest colonies of the United States are. In why England? Why not France? Why not Spain? And I think it's because England is the one that directly takes us over, and is what it becomes the English colonies, and then from the English colonies, not the French, not the Spanish, not the Portuguese, it comes to the United States. And that's why we're really focusing on the English side, because that is really not only are many of Americans descendants of the English, but also our actual country itself came from England. And so that's why we'll be looking at those. And every American should know the two earliest colonies. And then objective 4, what two types of colonies were there? Again, we're going to talk about the different types that there were. There are many more than two different types, but we're just going to talk about two. And how were the Spain and and Portugal colonies different from France and English? And that's going to take a little bit of thinking is on your part. You're going to have to think about this a little bit because it's not so clear. You're going to have to think about, okay, we learned that the Spanish and the Portuguese came, they set up bases, they exploited the people, they exploited the resources, took them, and then left. They weren't so concerned about really establishing a society. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that in depth. And those are our objectives. So let's start off with, first and foremost, both the French and, again, even the English are looking for, and nobody's been able to find except for Diaz and those guys, find an all-water route to Asia through the, and so they'd been looking for a long time, and they know that you have to go around the tip of Africa to do it. But there is this idea still that there might be a faster way and an easier way if you go through the cold water passages in what we call modern day Canada. And so that's what they're going to be looking for. There's this idea that if you come up the St. John's River and you come through here in these major lakes that to some people might even look like seas, that you would eventually be able to get over to the other side. And we really know there's not really a way to do that unless you go incredibly far north or if you go incredibly far south. But that is going to be what they're trying to do. And two fairly influential people, Giovanni de Verrazzano and Jacques Carrière, are both these two French explorers. And Really, Jacques Carrière, I want you guys to know a little bit more because he has a little bit more success and he has a little bit more impact on this. He's going to come up and he's going to explore the St. Lawrence River. And that's going to be this river here. I think I called it the St. John's earlier. It's not. It's the St. Lawrence River here. St. John's is over this way more. And he's going to be exploring the St. Lawrence River, and he's gonna, as he comes through here, he's gonna start naming things. What do you do when you first find something? Of course, name it after the country you represent or whatever. And so he starts to call it New France. This is to make sure that everybody else knows who owns it, and he's saying that the French own it now. And the French are going to be very early on into into trapping animals and creating pelts from those animals. Trapping is that's going to be a really big deal, and a lot of this is going to be taught to them by the Native Americans. And so this is one of the early things that we could see about why the French have a different outcome than perhaps the rest of the Europeans with the Native Americans, is the French relied on the Indians to teach them certain things, and they certainly respected the Indians in this way, especially with beaver pelts. Here we have a beaver pelt that was very common for them to do, to make them out of hats or make them into a nice, muffs or something else like that. And so the French are going to use the Native Americans quite a bit to do this. Now the French are going to have a big impact, and we can still see their influence in Canada, and they're going to build up a trading post in Quebec. This is going to be the actual first European settlement in Canada, and it was created by Samuel de Champlain. And what he does is he builds this area in Quebec, and it's this fort. And even to this day, what is the major language that people in Quebec speak versus the rest of, not the rest, but large parts of Canada? It is French. They speak a lot of French. And why? Because their descendants or the people in Quebec today, their ancestors, are French, and that's going to become from that early time period. Now, the French are not going to be fighting or killing or even trying to enslave Native Americans, and it turns out if you don't do that, people will like you a lot more. Um, and a lot of that's because they're going to be trading. They're going to be doing things like the beaver pelts and things that are going to make them have relationships. And this is one argument that people bring up today, that in the world, if you want two countries to never fight, what should you do? You should get two countries that you are trading with, so that way you can not have any fighting. This is what many people say explains why China and the United States, even though we have a pretty tough and pretty harsh feeling towards one another, we haven't gone to fight one another really. And why? Because we rely so much on each other for trading. And so the French really don't have much fighting with the Native Americans, maybe small groups of men here and there with some tribes, especially tribes that they are not trading with. So if you're trading with these tribes and these tribes hate this other tribe, that tribe might try to fight you because they don't like the fact that you're helping their enemies. Champlain is going to trade, and he's going to protect some tribes, and then this is an example of what I'm saying, from the group of the Iroquois. The Iroquois are a tremendously fierce tribe up in the northeastern part of the United States, and Champlain is going to be making deals, trading with these Native Americans, and one of the deals the Native Americans are going to ask is that they try to protect them from the Iroquois, and Champlain will actually do this. Now, just like the Spanish, this is a similarity between the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, is after they went through, now they didn't maybe go in and they sent explorers, but instead of sending conquistadors, they sent more just people to come in and kind of live and trade with the Native Americans, learn from the Native Americans. And because of this, there was not really conquistadors or conquerors. Again, most of the fighting between the French and the Native Americans were on small terms or between warring tribes. And so but one similarity that the French do have with the Spanish and the Portuguese is that they would send Jesuit missionaries. France at this time although it does have many Protestant faiths in it, is going to have a very close connection to Catholicism still. And so they will be sending Jesuit missionaries from the Catholics. There will also be a Protestant sect called Calvinists. You may have heard of John Calvin, who Calvinists believed that God foreordained or foreknew who was going to live or die. And so or not live or die, I'm sorry, that foreknew who was going to be saved or not saved. And so all you had to do is search your soul and find out if God had saved you or not saved you. This is called pre or foreordination, or pre being preordained. And so Calvinism was a very, very popular Protestant faith that broke off from Catholicism in France. And so there'll be several Calvinist missionaries coming through as well. And so the French, they start their new structure, and the French do this very differently than really anybody else, especially the English. The French are going to send the king himself. King Louis is going to send what's called a military governor. Now, this is different from our governors in that our governors we elect and we appoint, and they are working for us. In this system, the military general and governor, I should say, is not called by the people, it is called by the king. And the king does this, right, because his interests, he wants to make sure his interests are what are met. And so he makes a he assigns the military governors to be over the colonies that they establish, and that military governor might call a civil administrator, or an intendant is what we call it, um, and a Catholic bishop, and the Catholic bishop would be called from France too. And so, as you can see, the early three big leaders, rather it be your religious leader, your civil leader, or your governor, none of them are elected by people. And this really explains why France doesn't have the problems that the United States and England are going to have later, because they never give their colonies much opportunity for freedom, if that makes sense. So France is going to go very, very slowly. By 1700, there's only going to be 15,000 colonists. And this is because of the incredibly harsh lifestyle and the Indian raids that they will be going through. Again, these warring tribes don't respect the French. And so they're going to raid them, and it's going to be very tough to live in a new environment, new weather, new climate, new way of working. It's just very tough. So many people don't want to risk that time, or that adventure. They're going to establish colonies along the St. Lawrence River. Rivers have always played an important, since in world history, rivers have played a very important part of civilization. Civilizations have always built their civilizations near water routes because they want to make sure they have good, clean water. And so they're going to be building them along the St. Lawrence River as well as the Great Lakes, including Detroit. Now, Detroit itself is actually a French colony. Detroit is, we'll go into a little bit more about Detroit here in a little bit, but it is an important thing in this day. Detroit has some influences from France, from clear back here in the 1600s. One term that the French used was coureurs de bois, and I'm sure I have totally destroyed that. My French is not good. And this is the adoption, or what it means is the adoption of Indian lifestyle. So many French men, rather than keeping their French culture, decided that they really liked the idea of becoming a fur trading man. And so they really started to adopt more French cultures. Or not French culture, I'm sorry, Native American cultures. And they started to really integrate with the Native Americans. So instead of demanding Native Americans integrate to the European or the French, they start to integrate with the Native Americans. Now, last time we talked about mulatto versus mestizo and groups like that. Well, what happens when French, like, right, if a Spaniard, and a Native American have children together, they create mestizos, right? Today, modern day Mexico, most Mexicans come from a descendants or a lineage of of both Spanish and Native American. And we know that Europeans with African Americans, it created mulattoes. But what happens when somebody that is French meets and has children with a Native American? They are going to create a group called Metis. And in this picture right here is actually a family, a Metis family here. They may not look as I don't know the word, but they may not look as that. You can tell that they have a lot of European in them as well as Native American. There is a mixture here, and a lot of this is because of these fur trading men deciding that they wanted to take on that lifestyle. Robert de La Salle sought this Northwest Passage And so he was looking for this Northwest Passage, the ability to go through these rivers, get out to the other side, and ultimately to Asia. Instead, he finds the Gulf of Mexico. That is incredibly off course, right? He was supposed to be kind of up in here, and he ends up clear back down here. So that's an important thing because he finds a whole new area, a very nice area. The Gulf of Mexico is great for trading, for food, for cities right there. There's many great and important cities that come from the Gulf of Mexico. And he accidentally, kind of like Columbus, discovers this land. Okay. And so he's going to claim this land for himself. So if we're looking at cities that are not English based, right? Not English based in that the ancestry, the people who settled it are not English. We can find Detroit is one of the first ones. Detroit is a French influenced city, okay? As well as New Orleans and Louisiana in general. Louisiana, you can probably guess, is named after King Louis. King Louis, Louisiana, right? It's named after the king. And New Orleans is no example. There is a city, Orleans, in France, and this is New Orleans, okay? As well as Detroit. There is a Detroit in France, and now there is one in the New World as well. Many people are going to die of this area. You can only imagine if you go down to New Orleans. If you've ever been near the Gulf of Mexico, it's incredibly humid, has a lot of water, right? And there's going to be a lot of disease in those areas because water allows disease to live, and so people are going to be established there, but many of them are going to pass away from this. So we've talked a little bit about the French. We're going to spend most of our time talking about the English, okay? Because the English are such an impact on the American, the United States culture. So first and foremost, if you wanted to come to the New World, you didn't just go because that was incredibly risky. So and not to mention it was illegal. So if you wanted to go to the New World, what you must do is you must get a charter. A charter is a certificate of permission. You probably learned this a long time ago, but it is what gives you permission to travel from your country to a new place. Now, a lot of the people who were getting these charters were people that were part of what's called a joint stock company. These were business ventures that ran, instead of having one investor, there was many investors. Now think about this. If your friend comes up to you and says, "Hey, I want to start a business." You might say, "Well, why don't you just start the business by yourself?" Because if they start the business, think about all the risk that they are having. If they start the business, that means that they have to put all the money in, they have to work hard, and they have to try as hard as they can to make the business successful. And if it is not successful, they lose everything. Where if you get four friends to come in on it, you put all of your resources together, you put your money together, and instead of losing everything, you lose only 25%. How it mitigates the loss. And so joint stock companies were the same thing. The companies shared in loss, but they also shared in profit. So it was risky, they knew that, and rather than put all of their stuff on the line, they decided that if they did it together, this would mitigate those losses, and it would be helpful because their cultures were, or their colonies were, much more likely to survive. Now their job though is to plant or crops or do something that is going to help them bring money back for the company. They're not there to just establish and live themselves. They are there to give or supply certain resources back to the company and to the country in which they come from. What do we call this? You should know this vocab word from the last section of notes. It's mercantilism, right? The idea that those people go out, they take the resources, they come back, and they give it to the mother country, right? Well, an example of this is going to be Sir Walter Raleigh. He's a very good friend of Queen Elizabeth I, and he's going to try to establish a city called Roanoke. And you may have heard of Roanoke because Roanoke is not successful. And this is the answer to part of that objective. It is one of the very first civilizations that is established. So first, the trip, he couldn't land because of bad weather. Imagine you sailed all the way across the Atlantic and you're trying to get into, you know, the bay or to the coast. Instead of being able to, drop anchor and get all the supplies off. You try to wait it out because there's just bad weather sitting there. And he really is not able to ever dock because he waits there for a day, then 2 days, and the weather's not going away. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. And so he has to actually decide to turn around and go home, so that way his men don't die of starvation or of something else, something that would be based from the weather. Um, and then secondly, when they did get there, they established their town. Sir Walter Raleigh leaves. He says, I'll be back with more supplies and more stuff. And when he gets back, they are gone. Everyone is gone. The only thing that they know is that there is a etched in a tree a Native American name. And I think it is the Crow. I'm not positive of that. But they don't know if the Native Americans came and killed all of the inhabitants or if they just simply died of disease. But what we do know is there's no bodies. We can't find anybody. It's just gone. And so many historians speculate as what happened. Some say that they must have left in search of more food or water, hoping to have something, and then died out. Other people think that, the Native Americans killed them. Other people think they died of disease. But what we do know is that they disappeared. Now, these early areas that we're talking about are going to be up the Chesapeake Bay. So the very first part, Chesapeake Bay, starts over by like Virginia, goes all the way up behind Maryland and Delaware. The Potomac River, if you go to Mount Vernon on American Heritage, when you see Washington's home, it's off of the Potomac River, right? It's upstream quite a bit, but that Potomac River comes from the Chesapeake Bay, and the Chesapeake Bay goes quite a bit. It goes very high, it goes up past Delaware, so it's a huge, huge, huge bay. Now, again, whenever we step foot here, we need to remember that the English, they're saying, we found this new place, we found this new land, right? Columbus, everybody else. But what we know is that there was already people living here. It's kind of almost ironic to say that a group of people are, that they founded a place when there's a bunch of people living there watching you come, right? And this is no exception. On the Chesapeake Bay, there was the Algonquin tribes. Now, the Algonquin tribes were not just one group or one tribe. They were several thousands of tribes, okay? And they had 24,000 Indians, 30 different tribes, but they had all come together and said, we want one major chief. We might have minor chiefs of each our tribe, but we have one major chief, and it was Powhatan. Now, why should you know who Powhatan is? Well, he's going to play a very important role with some of the early Americas and the Americans, and specifically has a daughter that's incredibly famous that all of you have heard about, and her name is Pocahontas, right? Now, at first, he's going to seek to kill the colonists, and he does not like them coming. But then he starts to decide that the colonists might be actually helpful, just like the French had been helpful with other tribes. Maybe these colonists could kill some of the more interior Native Americans that were a problem for the Algonquins. One such person was John Smith, who was a Virginian, and he went to Virginia, and when he went there, he actually gave the description that it was overgrown and not developed. And so he looks at this as an opportunity for farmland, that he can come here and make good farms. And he'll play one of these important roles for the Algonquin tribes. So this comes into our second. What's the second? So the first colony is Roanoke. It is a disaster. The second one is going to be Jamestown. It's established in 1607 by the Virginia Company. So again, this is a joint stock company. It transported 10,000 people, but most of them are going to die. Okay, the colonists and Indians are going to fight because of this land, and this is where the Algonquins have some struggles with the colonists. The colonists are going to eventually capture Pocahontas. Now, Pocahontas, this is going to be problematic. For Powhatan, Pocahontas is his favorite daughter. And so he does not like this. And so the colonists, originally they're getting along with them. Everything's fine. Everything's okay. and they're trading and they're doing things. But eventually, the Algonquins are not going to like the colonists because they are taking more land and more things, and this is worrisome to Powhatan. So, in a way to try to stop the Native Americans or to try to have control or leverage, we should say, over them, they're going to capture Pocahontas. And again, Powhatan makes it very clear Pocahontas is his favorite daughter, which I think is very offensive, right, to his other daughters. They're like, wow, dad thinks a lot. But Pocahontas is captured. She is going to actually convert to Christianity, and she's going to marry a man named John Rolfe. She'll go back to England. She'll eventually die, but she will assimilate much into English culture. Here's a picture of her in kind of her English dress up. Okay. And Powhatan, he's like, you know what? It's not worth it. Let's not fight. And he's going to make a peace treaty, and everything's going to be fine because he doesn't want to fight and he doesn't want to lose his daughter. However, after Powhatan dies, his brother, and I cannot say his name, Opekanaho, takes power. That was a good job, huh? And he has a very different way of looking at this. He decides that it is not okay that the colonists continue to do the things that they're doing, that they not respect the Native Americans, that they take their land and their resources, and he's going to fight them. And it's not going to go well for him at all. Colonies are going to give their main source is going to be a cash crop. Again, these are joint stock companies, and so John Rolfe, for instance, is going to be cultivating tobacco in 1616, and the English absolutely love tobacco. If you don't know, look at these statistics here. Okay, it became super popular, and 200,000 pounds were shipped in 1624. That's a lot of tobacco, but by 1640, so less than 20 years, 1.5 million pounds was being sent. They say that in England, everybody smoked. Everybody. The only person that didn't smoke was the king, and he did not like the smoke at all. I think it was King George. He said that he thought a disgusting habit. He didn't like it, and everybody kind of made fun of him for it. But now, I don't know who got the last laugh, him or them, but he did not like smoking. So these joint stock companies are going to play an important role as they're trying to make money. Now, if personally you had to live in one, the joint stock company versus what we'll call later a royal colony being one made from the king, you might be, oh, joint stock company, there's more freedom, right? But in really a lot of ways, the royal colonies were better because when you went to a joint stock company, their business, their whole motive is to make money. And so if they can send you with the least amount of supplies as possible, and if they can send you, things that'll help them in their bottom line, then all the much better for them. Where in the royal colonies, their motive is to have you be a successful colony, have you actually live. And so they will send you more than what you need in most cases. From these joint stock companies, though, plantations are going to develop. People are going to come and they're going to gain 50 acres of land. And the wealthy would pay many people to come and work on those lands. Originally, it would be like an indentured servant, somebody that you pay to come over, or it might be somebody that you pay that way. It's going to, as we know, turn into slavery. It's going to be free labor. You pay for somebody one time, you buy them, and they become your slave. This is going to be extremely popular in the South, and it's going to explain why slavery has such a land and such a hold in the United States. Now, this is going to be one of the most important parts between England and France, and that is in the United States, the Americas come together and they decide to make a House of Burgesses. A House of Burgesses is kind of like Congress. It's a representative body who represents the colonies in America. Now, the reason I'm saying that this is so very important is because I had a teacher, Mr. Jensen, who told me, and I agree with this so much, see so much wisdom in what he said now. He said, once you give someone something, you can never take it back. Now, the French, when they established a city, did not give a lot of freedom or give really anything to the colonists. They had royal governors, they had an intendant that was picked, they had bishops that were picked from the king or the leadership back in France. The King of England allowed the Americas to have a little bit more autonomy than that. He allowed them to set up their own bodies to represent them, to do their own bidding, to do their own things. By doing this, fast forward 150 years, what you're going to find is colonists saying, we have always had these freedoms, and we, when the king asks or wants to take back some of those freedoms, they will be incredibly upset and they will not be okay with that. So I think it's an important distinction that we should be making here. Now, the House of Burgesses had the power to make laws and raise taxes, and this was okay to the Americans because they were able to be represented. Now, there will be problems that will go on in the future, but this is going to be the problem that they have later when England tries to take away their representative body, and they're going to say, you can't tax us without representation. And this is going to stem from the idea of we have our own group, the House of Burgesses, to represent us. Now, like I said, there are two different types of colonies that the crown had or that England had. The first one is the royal colony. It belonged to the crown. The crown owns this colony. Okay. The second one is a proprietary colony. Joint stock companies are proprietary colonies. These are colonies that belong to a businessman or an investor. So John Rolfe is an example of a joint stock or a proprietary colony. You still have to get a charter from England to go to the new country, but the king signs off, and then that's really his concern. He doesn't own the colony. It's the business that owns the colony. Now, he has maybe some control over it, but he doesn't own it. Going back to Powhatan's brother, the Indians fought and killed a third of the colonists, and so they'll have an initial victory, but eventually the colonists will come back together and they will fight and kill most of the Algonquin Indians. And so in the end, it's going to be not good for them. And this is not the only civil dispute that happens. This is between the Native Americans and the English, but there will be also conflicts between the English and the English themselves, specifically in Bacon's Rebellion. There's a royal governor of Virginia. His name's William Berkeley, and he decided he was going to impose heavy taxes on farmers. And people don't really like this. They don't love the idea of having, nobody likes taxes. And so they decide that he's not really going about this the way that he really should be. This is him kind of making a decision, and he doesn't really have the right to do that. The representative House of Burgesses gets that right. So the colonists also are not only mad because he's making them pay heavy taxes, but they're also mad because he starts limiting their ability to kill Native Americans. And what this means is up to this point, the early colonists, if there was Native Americans around and they were worried about them, they would get together and they would just go kill Native Americans. Pretty vicious. But what's going to happen is that Berkeley is going to restrict that. He's going to make it so you can't kill Native Americans as easily. This is going to be the final straw for a man named Bacon. Bacon is going to organize other farmers, and he's going to have Bacon's Rebellion. Again, he gathers these farmers, and he's going to actually drive Berkeley out of town, and he's going to burn the town down. Now, unfortunately for Bacon, he was very successful initially, but he's going to get sick, and then he's going to die. And when he gets sick and dies, Berkeley is going to come back to town and basically resume where he left off. So why talk about this? If Bacon just dies and the king or the royal governor just comes back, how does this demonstrate, or why do we care about this even? Because again, I want you to understand that this early on, it demonstrates that Americans started to expect a certain amount of freedom. They didn't want somebody telling them what to do. And this is a very early example of that. So in 1632, we've talked really mostly about the northern colonies, and we'll talk about the southern colonies. 1632, Maryland is going to be established, and guess what? Most of these colonies have a name after somebody. Maryland is established after Queen Mary. If you remember, Queen Mary is Henry VIII's daughter, and she was the one that they call her Bloody Mary often. She is the Catholic queen. Her dad was Protestant, and he was not great with Catholics. Then she becomes queen. She's Catholic, and she starts killing Protestants. And then her sister Elizabeth becomes queen, and she starts killing. Right? It goes back and forth between Catholics and Protestants. It's not a good turn. But a colony is established after her, and it's Maryland, right? King Charles is going to give land to Lord Baltimore, and Lord Baltimore is going to turn this into a proprietary colony. So Baltimore, Maryland, right? Lord Baltimore is friends with Queen Mary. and he likes Queen Mary. He's Catholic, and he gets along with her well, and so he establishes a city inside of the state of Mary called Baltimore. And today we know Baltimore very well, a very big city in Maryland, right? And it's a proprietary colony. He's trying to make it as a business success. Now, what's interestingly enough is that this was Baltimore, and specifically Maryland, was supposed to be actually refuge a refuge, I'm sorry, for Catholics. Catholics were trying to escape some of the bad things that were happening to them in England and other places in the colonies. And so it was supposed to be a place that they could go and find safety, so that way they could come and be okay. Now, the ironic thing is that actually more Protestants ended up in Maryland than Catholics did, and that's kind of ironic that it was set up for Catholics, but more Protestants came. Carolina, North and South Carolina, they're both named after King Charles. Carolina, right? This is what it's named after from him. Again, they were established first as a proprietary colony, but like a lot of proprietary colonies, as they went on, they will be established as a royal colony by the colonists later. And most of the time, the colonists did this because they were not being treated very well under the proprietary colonies, and they'd rather be treated better under a royal colony. Now, Georgia is established in 1732 as a proprietary colony as well. It was established by a man named James Oglethorpe. And really, at first, Georgia is set up as a colony for debtors. It was a place that people who owed tremendous amounts of money could go and they could work off their money. And so that's where a lot of the people in Georgia came from. But also, some came to Georgia as religious refugees from Switzerland and Germany. So people who were trying to be Protestant and live in those countries that were being treated poorly or badly could move to Georgia as a way for safety. And so this is why a lot of families come, is they're coming to establish and pay off money that they might have owed. Now, interestingly enough, Georgia does not allow any alcohol, and they don't at first even allow slaves or plantations. So this is what's very interesting. When we think of slavery and we think of the South, oftentimes we think of Georgia. But the colonists get very upset about this, and eventually they're going to establish a royal colony in 1752. And now that they're not proprietary, they can have these things. They can have alcohol, they can have slaves, and they can form plantations. This picture here is of my it's a great grandfather's daughter's husband's family, the Varnes, and this is a plantation they had in South Carolina. It is now a hunting lodge, but this house I've been to, it's a very nice home for the time period. Even today, it's very nice. It's a lodge now. And this is Jerry Varne himself. Jerry Varne was incredibly tall. I think he was 7'1", something like that. And you can see his wife here. Jerry and the Varnes still own this land, and still do a lot of hunting and a lot of other things on this land there. So it's kind of an interesting thing. My family comes from here. It kind of have some personal connection to this. So now we've talked about the southern colonies. Let's talk a little bit about the northern colonies and the people who are settling there. So first off, we need to separate the terms Puritan and separatist. A Puritan, take the word Puritan and think about it. They wanted to purify the Church of England. So these are people who are not Catholic. They don't like the Catholic Church. They do like the Church of England, the church that was formed by Henry VIII. In England they call this Anglicanism. In the United States, for some reason, we've decided to call this Episcopalian. I don't know how that happened, but we call it Episcopalian. And these members of this church, they think that the Church of England is good, but they have some major problems with it, and they need to purify the church. They want to keep the church as a whole, but they've decided that they want to try to purify the church. They want to make it simpler. They don't want church service. Really, they feel like church service is too Catholic. If you've ever been to a Catholic mass, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of ritual. There's a lot of prayers in Latin, and a lot of, lots of different ceremonial things that are going on. And they're not going to like that. They want it to be very simple and very, very basic. And they're going to also object from wealth and the power of the bishops. They're going to say, as Christians, we're not supposed to be wealthy. That's the whole parable of the wealthy man with Jesus. And they don't like the fact that in the Catholic Church there is people that are incredibly wealthy and that bishops hold a lot of power. They don't like any of these things. Now, compare that and contrast that, I should say, with a group called the Separatists. Separatists were much stricter than the Puritans. So if the Puritans want to purify the church, what do the Separatists want to do? They want to separate themselves from the Church of England. They feel like that really the new church is got too much Catholicism and it's too Catholic, and they want to be separated totally from the Church of England. Okay. Now the problem is the Church of England is the actually official land, church of the land, and at this time period, you had to pay taxes to the church. You had like your tithing, you had to pay that, and you actually, to some degree, had to even go to church. Now that might not always be enforced, but often you had to go, and you had to go to church semi frequently. Now, this English subjects are going to require, and like I said, attend services and pay those taxes. But those who do not are going to be what we call dissenters, and they're going to be put in jail, they're going to be fined, they're going to be put in prison. And so separatists are going to eventually try to leave, and they want to get away from that to do their own thing. So we have really two different colonies I want to talk about. The Plymouth colony is going to be formed by this group of separatists. They move from the Netherlands in 1708. Now I have some family from this movement that came over, and they left and they went to the Netherlands because they felt like they were getting in a lot of trouble in England. They were put in prison. They were put in jail because they wouldn't pay their tax and they wouldn't go to church. They wanted to be separated, wanted their own religion. So they decided to move to the Netherlands so they could escape English control. And then, but they never planned on the Netherlands being their home. They never really actually wanted that to be the home. They hoped that they could go back to England or that they could go somewhere else. And so when the New World comes as an opportunity, they jump on it because now they can go and be a couple thousand miles away, not a couple, 1,000 miles away from the King of England and from the Church of England. Their children, they didn't like the fact that they were being in the Netherlands and that they were becoming Dutch. The Dutch lived in the Netherlands, and they really worried about this. The Dutch were very open-minded and were one of the, maybe the only European state that had freedom of religion, and so they don't really they don't mind that these people are living here. But the people that move there don't really like the Dutch. They don't like their Dutch influence, so they want to get out of there. So a war with Spain starts to seems to be coming on the scene, and this was a time basically the Protestants here in this new world, or I should say in the Netherlands, decided this would be the right time for them to leave. So them and a bunch of others were led by a name named William Bradford. 35 separatists joined, and 66 others on the Mayflower. And so they all joined together, and in 1620 they left and they came to the New World. Now, William Bradford is my 12th great grandfather, and this is me at his headstone in Plymouth, Plymouth Colony. There this is called an obelisk, and he's got his his information here. It's actually in Hebrew and in English here. And so I was able to go see my 12th great grandfather, and it was really kind of an interesting and really kind of cool experience for me. But William and these other separatists, they leave, and their sponsor is the Virginia Company, this joint stock company. The people who are paying and helping them get across is going to be them. Now, they intended to go up to the Hudson River, but instead of being in the Hudson River, they landed at the entrance of the Cape Cod. Now, the Cape Cod is, if you look at Massachusetts, it's that long cape that goes around and kind of comes back into the bay. That's called Cape Cod. It's really kind of cool place and a great drive if you have the chance ever to go out there. Now, they founded Plymouth Colony, which is today south of present-day Boston. And the colony grew very, very large and was very, very successful. And they were able to practice their own religion. Let's compare that to Massachusetts Bay. Massachusetts was not formed by the Separatists. It was formed by Puritans, people who want to just fix and purify the Church of England. Okay, and they were sponsored by the Massachusetts Bay Company. So one's the Virginia Company, the other one's the Massachusetts Bay Company. In 1630, a man named John Winthrop set out with 11 ships and 700 people for New England. And when he sets out, the colony is going to grow incredibly fast. And they're going to establish other towns even nearby because they can't keep up with the population. why would it be so much more successful here than in the Plymouth colony? Well, I think a lot of things. Number one, the Plymouth colony had separatists, not Puritans. Separatists were a lot less willing to let people come. Two, they got blown off course. They were not ever meaning to be in they were never meaning to be where they were at. And so I think this also established or made it so that way people didn't settle there because they weren't even in the place they were supposed to be. Technically, they weren't even supposed to settle the land that they were on. Their charter gave them permission to settle in the Hudson River, not Cape Cod. So the success of Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies inspired what we call the Great Migration. Up to this point, when you read about St. Or Jamestown, I should say, or Roanoke, if you're English, you don't like the idea of coming over. Why? Because if you come over, you have a strong possibility of dying. Now, with the success of Plymouth and with the Massachusetts Bay colony, people are seeing that people are not only living, but they're thriving in this new land. And so 20,000 Englishmen and women are going to come over into the New England area. And we call this time period where a whole bunch of English people were coming in a very short amount of time period. We call this the Great Migration. But there aren't the Puritans might seem like a very pure group, a very good group, and same with the Separatists. And there's some things that I think are really ironic again and that are important to point out. Many of the dissenters left the Massachusetts Bay Colony and they settled new towns. And why? Because the Puritans were not as pure or as kind or as good as what we might think. For instance, Thomas Hooker was a Puritan minister, and his congregation settled the Connecticut River Valley. Okay, they adopted the first written constitution. That's why they're so important, is because they're the first ones that we can look at in this area and say there's a written constitution by the people. Again, this is this freedom I'm talking about. England's giving these people a tremendous amount of freedom. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were also created, and it extended voting rights to all freemen, not just church members. So this is a big deal that's happening. But you have other people like Roger Williams, who's a separatist minister, and he believed in what's called religious tolerance. He didn't think that you should shame or be mean or ridicule other faiths. And he doesn't like the fact that the separatists he lives with, or the Puritans even, do this. They don't like that. And so he's going to decide that he thinks there should be a separation between the church and government. We take this for granted today. We think of a separation, and that just means, oh, you can't pray in school and you can't, do this or do that. But at this time period, this was a big radical idea. In fact, so much that he was kind of kicked out of the area. He was not allowed to live with them anymore. So he, being pretty wealthy, bought land from the Narragansetts to establish Providence, Rhode Island. So Rhode Island becomes this place where people can come who have different religions, and they can practice with toleration and not resentment or judgment or anything else. Other people like Anne Hutchinson are also going to believe this, and they're going to try to do the same kind of thing. And they're going to teach some radical ideas. They're going to teach that you don't need a minister anymore, that you could just yourself connect with the Spirit. She'll be imprisoned, tried, and then she'll be exiled. They say you don't have to go back to England, but you're not staying here. And so the Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to kick her out, and she'll actually end up in Rhode Island with Roger Williams. And he's, to tell you the honest truth from what I've read, not too excited to have her there, but he embraces and allows people to believe what they want. Hutchinson's brother-in-law is going to leave Massachusetts, and he's going to start a royal a settlement in present-day New Hampshire. And in 1679, it's going to be actually a royal colony. He'll petition the king and ask if the king would be in charge of it completely, and the king will eventually do that. So just specifically, just a couple things real quick here to go over with some of our earliest colonies. New York. New York was not originally called New York. It was actually called New Amsterdam. And it was very diverse. New York has always had a diverse population. The population was made up of English, not surprising, Dutch, Scandinavians, Germans, French, Native Americans, and enslaved Africans. It's going to start to grow and prosper under English rule, and they're going to establish a treaty with the Iroquois on a fur trade. They're going to do a lot of business together. But eventually the Duke of York is going to come, and he's going to give the land south of the Hudson River to some of his political allies. And so now it's going to start being named New York after him. And the people near him that are going to separate are going to name this new land, his political allies, from New Jersey. By the 1700s, New York and New Jersey had become, once again, royal colonies. Another group that was religious but was significantly different than everyone else, we call them nonconformists, meaning they did not conform to what everyone else was doing, was the Quakers. If you've ever seen Quaker oatmeal, that is supposed to represent a Quaker. The Quakers are upset. They upset a lot of people because they are an incredibly pacifist faith, meaning they're not, which is surprising that they would make people so mad, but they were uniquely different from everybody else, and people did not like that, and so they're going to set up their own place to live, for themselves. They believed in direct personal communication with God. There's no need for a minister, hierarchy, priest, bishop. You don't need that. Just you and God. That's all you need. They had very simple meetings, oftentimes even outdoors. And the members would just, what was the service like? It didn't have a minister or a bishop or anybody else leading it. It would just be members deciding to stand up and speak and teach other people. They really did believe in the equality of all men and women, and they wanted that, and this is one of those radical ideas that made people not like them. And they were also pacifists. They refused to fight. They wouldn't fight Native Americans. They wouldn't fight in wars. They would not fight in anything because they've said they believe Christianity was ultimately, against fighting wars. And they were only welcomed in one place, and that was going to be Rhode Island. So eventually they're going to settle in Pennsylvania, with specifically because of the religious toleration. And it's going to be something that's going to allow them to, have the freedom that they hadn't been able to have before. And this is going to be a big help to the Quakers, as they had been really not welcomed anywhere. And this is going to help them significantly in their pursuit and in their worshiping, with their radical ideas. And it is radical. It should be, it is radical, because they are teaching things at the time period that nobody really, looked at or believed, including, equality for women. William Penn is going to be the wealthy, man who becomes a Quaker despite his family's petitions not to, and he will buy Pennsylvania and, name it Pennsylvania. And his name was William Penn, so you can guess where Pennsylvania comes from. So, how were exactly the Spanish and the Portuguese and the colonies different from the French and the English? So, this is the answer to your last objective there. So, Spain and Portugal, they mostly conquered existing cities. They didn't create new cities. They just went into old cities that Native American indigenous people had and then took them over. So that's one of the big differences between them. They were much more violent towards Native Americans. The colonists, don't get me wrong, in England especially, were violent towards, Native Americans, but not probably in the same way that the Spanish and Portuguese were. The government was still from the mother country, so the government was completely in charge still, and that's really actually true of France even as well. And they were mostly Catholic in these two or three other areas. Now the French and the English, they wanted to settle and have more stability so they could apply stricter laws on the people. They also wanted to create their own cities, not occupy existing ones. They were more accepting of the Native Americans, especially of the French. Maybe not so much the English, but especially the French. And the French and the English were much more centered on religion. There was a lot more religious purposes in going. You saw that a lot of it wasn't religion, that it was joint stock companies and such, but also a lot of them were actually religious. And instead of being Catholic, most of them are Protestant. And so these are probably the fundamental differences between the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese. And you should write this down. This is the answer to the last objective there. Let's go back really quickly then and make sure we've answered all the objectives. How and why were the French more successful with the Native Americans? Remember, it was because of trading, right? They were trading with one another, learning, how to make and trap, how to make beaver pelts and how to trap. Also because the French started to intermarry, right? That phrase, the Cora de, how do you say it? The Coria des Bois, the adoption of Indian lifestyle. So this created Metis families, remember that? So they're intermarrying, they're trading, they're doing all that kind of stuff. That's the answer to objective one. Objective two, what are some of the key places that the French established? Really, there's two big main ones that we want you to know. Number one, Detroit, and number two, New Orleans and Louisiana. Okay, so you need to know generally those ones. Oh, and Quebec. You should also know that Quebec was established by the French as well. What were the two earliest colonies for the English? Remember, it was Roanoke and it was Jamestown. Okay, Roanoke was successful, Jamestown was not. What two types of colonies were there? There are joint stock or proprietary, I should call it proprietary colonies, colonies that exist for business purposes to get money. And there's also royal colonies, colonies that were owned by the king. And objective five, how were Spain and Portugal colonies different from French and English? That was that last thing we just reviewed, so you should know that one. Okay. Now, as you finish off here, be thinking again, how has imperialism impacted the United States with its development of foreign policy? Think about how this is impacted in all this. Okay. Hopefully this makes sense. If you have any questions, we'll come back together and make sure you have two questions or two comments that you can bring to class so we can have a good, enriching conversation. Thanks, guys.